In this presentation, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the maths curriculum and talk about some of the issues with the curriculum at the moment. Before I do that, I want you to write down the numbers 1 to 5 in a line and tick against the number that you think best represents the way that you feel about how you were taught maths at school, and then tick against the number that you think represents how you feel about maths now, and see if there's a difference between those two. There's a video that goes along with this presentation that are some interviews of people in the street in San Francisco and how they feel about maths. Have a look at that video after you've watched this presentation. Sian Baylock in 2011 looked at maths facts and where they're stored in the brain, where she felt they were stored in the brain, and she felt that maths facts such as times tables facts were held in the working memory, the part of the memory that holds things ready to use in the now. And she found that when children were under pressure, for instance under the pressure of timed tests such as times tables tests, they couldn't access a lot of the facts in that working memory because of the stress. Stress blocked access to that working memory. And for many children, that's the beginning of the maths anxiety and the negativity towards maths that persists into adult life. In 2008, the Williams report found that there are very negative views about maths throughout society, particularly in the UK and the US, and it's not so much of a negative feeling in other countries. We're really strongly against maths in many ways in this country, and it's acceptable, they found, for people to say I'm not very good at maths or I don't like maths very much, and the same people that would be found to say that would be horrified to think that somebody thought they couldn't read or write very well, for instance. He suggested that there should be a programme of maths specialist teachers, particularly within primary, so that there was at least one person that had studied the pedagogy, the way of teaching maths deeply, the new ideas and the more up-to-date ways of teaching maths, so that they could spread that throughout their school and perhaps beyond their school. And those maths specialist teachers exist in a lot of schools now. But however, it's still very common to hear even primary teachers talking in a very negative way about maths. Maths is boring, they don't like maths very much, they're not very good at it. So there's still some way to go in elevating the status of maths in British primary schools. I think there's some key ways that you, starting out in your teaching careers, need to think about that issue. Firstly, be aware of your own possible maths anxiety. It could very well be that you've got a maths anxiety, you've got a fear of maths, or you've got a dislike of maths because of the way that you were taught maths at school. Didn't make it very engaging for you, just felt it very repetitive, perhaps quite stressful in many ways, particularly if you were the subject of a lot of timed tests. So, it's very important to be aware of that. Think about how you're coming to teaching of maths. Are you coming to it from a negative or a positive point of view? Don't teach maths the way that you were taught maths. Don't teach maths necessarily the way that you've seen other people teaching maths. Have a really good reason for teaching maths the way that you do. Think about it. We'll be doing a lot on this course about the best way, the evidence-informed ways of teaching maths successfully and making it engaging and interesting for children. Think about how you're teaching your maths, think about why you're teaching it a particular way, and in particular take a conceptual rather than a procedural approach. That is, we want children to understand the concepts, the ideas behind the maths that they're doing. We want them to see the patterns and the connections, not just the ways of writing it down, not just the procedures or the methods. Have a growth mindset towards maths. Understand that children might not be attaining very well at maths now, but it's your job and your role and your capability to help them be successful at maths. Everyone can be successful at maths. It's just a question of going from where they are now to that point of success. Have a growth mindset for yourself as well. Think, this is my understanding of maths at the moment, but it can be really good understanding of maths. I can have a great understanding of maths if I adopt a growth mindset approach. Be enthusiastic about maths and try to counter negative attitudes. One of the things I want you to do is, without identifying the person or people involved, write down any snippets of comments that you might hear in school from teachers or teaching assistants, which you think might show maths anxiety or a negative view of maths. People saying, "Oh, I'm not really good at this," or "I don't really get this." You know, try and see if you can identify whether there is a maths anxiety or a negativity towards maths among a certain, strand of teachers or teaching assistants. The first national maths curriculum came about in 1992, just not long after I'd started to teach. And that first maths curriculum had 14 attainment targets. It soon became clear that planning for those 14 attainment targets was going to be quite a headache and quite difficult to do. So the birth of the national curriculum in maths wasn't highly successful, and really caused it certainly caused a lot of anxiety for me in my formative years as a teacher, because I found it very, very difficult to plan for the 14 attainment targets and make sure I was doing a good job with each of them. In 1999, the National Numeracy Strategy came about, and that was an improvement. It slimmed the curriculum down a bit, made the structure of the curriculum a lot clearer. It gave us a lesson structure which was basically in 3 parts. We had to start off with a mental and oral starter, and that was put in there because at the time it was felt that there wasn't enough mental maths, enough oral discussion of maths concepts generally in primary schools. That's thankfully not the case now. So the idea was in 1999 that we'd start out the lessons with a mental and oral starter, move on to the main content, and then summarise at the end with a plenary. The curriculum was a spiral, so there were blocks of concepts in each term, and you'd touch each concept in a not very deep way in each term, but then you'd come back to it each term. So you wouldn't go in depth about something once a year, you'd go in quite a lot less depth, but 3 times a year. So it's what I'd call a spiral curriculum. The calculations document gave a lot of smaller steps for understanding the written calculations of addition, subtraction, multiplication and division. The slight problem with that was that in some schools, and you still see it now, that some of those intermediate methods, some of those small stepping stones to help children understand what they might do next, became full-blown methods in themselves, and it wasn't greatly widely understood that those were small stepping stones, so it created a lot of confusion in some schools. The early years foundation stage was ahead of the game. The maths was called problem solving, reasoning and number in the early years foundation stage, and was informed by what is still a really good document called Numbers and Patterns. The new curriculum, or the 2014 curriculum, is supposedly driven by fluency, reasoning and problem solving, and we'll be talking about what each of those means as we go through the course in maths. Maths is problem solving, reasoning and number is now called maths in the early years foundation stage, and throughout the curriculum as a whole there's been a greater emphasis on children understanding what they're doing rather than simply doing it, being able to apply it. And in particular, the expectations of what children can do at each stage have risen, so that now in the early years foundation stage, children should be able to count to 10, understand and use numbers, do simple addition and subtraction problems, describe shapes, spaces and measures. And that's all in the context of a balance between direct teaching and having environments, play environments in which enable them to learn and to deepen their understanding of those concepts. The programme of study is in year groups, but there's a flexibility so that the expectation of what they're supposed to achieve and what they're supposed to do can be fitted into phases. That's early years, Key Stage 1, lower Key Stage 2 and upper Key Stage 2. But there's a greater prescription about written calculations and the way that those are done. Some of the intermediate steps are dropped out, but they have to now, for the first time ever, be columnar in approach. I'm going to talk now a bit about schemes of work, maths maps and mastery. Schemes of work are often accompanied by a textbook. Examples that you see a lot are Abacus Evolve and the Collins, and there are good points and bad points about schemes of work. On the one hand, a thing that's often said that's a positive thing about them is that they have clear lesson plans for you to do and a clear progression, so that if it says week 3 equivalent fractions and it gives you a couple of lessons to build on equivalent fractions, then as a new teacher that's a really good thing. That's often thought to be a good thing. I personally think it's a bad thing. I think schemes of work are written for the general. They're not written for your class at this time. They don't know the spread of abilities and complexity of understandings in your class at that particular week, and they can't do. So they're written for a general audience. They're not written for your class. In terms of them giving you a good lesson plan, well, those lesson plans, there's two things that are wrong with those lesson plans. Firstly, because they don't fit your class at that particular week, you have to spend a lot of time adapting them, because you won't just be able to do them off the page. So, you know, they're not as helpful as they seem. Yeah, they're a good, clear lesson plan, but you will have to spend a lot of time adapting them for your class. Time you may as well spend thinking about a really good way of capturing the imagination of your children in that week. The second thing that's bad for them is when you read those lesson plans, they're quite dull. They're not out there, they're not trying something new, they're not going outside, they're not measuring the playground, they're not, you know, pretending to be a shop. They're written for a very bland, usually a very general kind of, you know, this will get you there kind of approach. So I'm against schemes of work and textbook approach. The government and the National Centre for Excellence in Teaching in Maths is currently trying out, particularly in Year 1, the use of textbooks to fit alongside the Singapore approach to maths, of which we'll talk in a little bit more detail later on in the course. Maths maps, I think, are a good idea. The difference between a maths map and a scheme of work is a scheme of work tells you what to do in each particular week and gives you a lesson plan. A maths map suggests that you have a certain way of progressing through the content and leaves it up to you then of how to teach that. Now, a good friend of mine once said to me that teachers that learned to teach in the 80s walked around thinking about how to write a lesson plan or a set of lessons that were going to capture the imagination of their children, the children in their class. Teachers who learned to teach in the 90s looked for a framework to tell them what to teach, and teachers that learned to teach in the noughties looked for the lesson plans online. Well, it's quite a funny comment, but there's a lot of truth to it, and I think that it's much easier, much more effective for you to look at what it is you're meant to achieve, teach the children addition without carrying, for instance, and think about some really good ways that might engage your children next week in doing that. That's not to say you can't look on the internet for ideas. It's not to say, and I think you should do, talk to your colleagues and people in your school to think of some good core ideas to do that. Once had a conversation with a young teacher in Macclesfield who couldn't quite get how he would move away from Abacus Evolve and just write his own lesson plans. And I said to him, and I've said this a lot to people since, you know, if you're thinking about your maths lessons for the week, look at the basic thing that you're meant to be achieving. So, for instance, equivalent fractions and comparing fractions in that week. Put your coat on, put the lead on the dog, walk down the canal, 15 minutes one way, think of some really good ideas, 15 minutes that are coming on the way back, think about how you might apply them to your class, and then just write them down in bullet points. That's your lesson plan. So thinking's more important than reading it off a page. Think about how you might adapt and make that maths map fit your class for the week that you want to be teaching it. There are two meanings of mastery, unfortunately, which have got a little bit unclear in the sort of general understanding. The first meaning of mastery is when children have gone beyond what is expected of them at their age, and they go up into a more of a mastery, or a more of a higher achievers kind of area. So they're said to be working at a mastery level. In general, though, in maths, what mastery means is the idea, which comes from both studies in Shanghai and studies in Singapore, the idea that instead of differentiating for the different levels of supposed attainment there are in our class, that we have a growth mindset approach, and we say there's certain basic things that all children in the class should be able to achieve, say, by the end of the week. We present that to them in many different ways. Instead of just saying this is the way we do it and this is one way of one model, we present it with many different models, and we expect them to get it by the end of the week. But if they're not getting it, then we put more effort into them. So we spend a bit more time with those particular individuals, so that by the end of the week, everybody's at a sort of basic, I've got a level of sort of basic understanding of that particular concept. It's the way that they teach in Shanghai, the way they teach in Singapore. We'll be talking a lot more about mastery, because it's very different from the way that we generally teach maths, and generally in Britain, because what we tend to do is differentiate. It's becoming much more common now to adopt this mastery approach of saying everybody's got to reach this level by the end of the week. These two references are really, really useful. The NCETM site is an absolute wealth of information and ideas for teaching maths, and to sort of discuss ideas within maths teaching. The self-evaluation tool is a little bit out of date and fits the pre-2014 curriculum, but it's very useful for you to see if you understand perhaps some of the sort of terms within maths and some of the ideas within maths that you should do, but many primary teachers don't. So use that self-evaluation tool, but do realise it is a little bit out of date. It fits more the pre-2014 curriculum. Enrich is a really, really good site. It's been recently updated. It's a really, really good source of conceptual activities. I thoroughly recommend both of those.